I should have left during intermission. That's what I tell myself now, sitting here in the dark with the ghosts of other people's applause still echoing off these worn velvet seats. The Riverside Community Theater holds maybe 200 people on a good night, and tonight was a good night. Every seat filled, every heart lifted by the kind of performance that reminds you why live theater matters. But I'm not thinking about any of that. I'm thinking about the way Julian Blake moved across that stage like he owned it, like he'd never left this place, like 20 years was nothing more than a long intermission. The program in my hands has been folded and unfolded so many times the paper feels soft as fabric. My wedding ring catches the dim safety lights as I smooth the creases again, and there it is. His name printed in bold letters under the heading of principal cast. Julian Blake as Thomas Mendelsohn. Not my name, though mine appears further down in smaller print. Elliot Monroe, co-director. The irony isn't lost on me. Even in a program, we're still playing the same roles we played in high school. Him in the spotlight, me in the shadows, making sure everything runs smoothly for everyone else. The theater has emptied around me without my noticing. The ushers have dimmed the lights and moved on to counting ticket stubs and collecting forgotten scarves. Somewhere behind me, a janitor pushes a cart loaded with cleaning supplies, the wheels squeaking against the worn carpet. The sound echoes in the empty space, mixing with the hum of old heating pipes and the distant rumble of cars starting up in the parking lot. I know I should go. Hannah will be expecting me home soon. Probably has a cup of chamomile tea waiting and questions about how the show went that I won't know how to answer. Micah has that chemistry test tomorrow morning, and I promise to help him review the periodic table one more time before bed. Normal life is waiting for me in the parking lot, behind the wheel of my practical Honda Civic with its coffee-stained cup holders and floor mats covered in rock salt. In the neat colonial house, where I've spent the last 15 years building a quiet, respectable existence. But I can't seem to make my legs work. Can't seem to unstick myself from this red velvet seat in the fourth row, center section, the same spot where I used to sit during dress rehearsals when we were 17. The fabric under my fingers is worn smooth by decades of audiences, and I wonder how many other people have sat in this exact seat, nursing their own secret heartaches while watching other people's stories unfold on stage. How many others have felt this particular kind of paralysis, caught between who they used to be and who they've become, between the life they chose and the one they left behind. The stage is empty now except for the ghost light, that single bulb they leave burning to keep the theater from falling into complete darkness. Theater superstition says it keeps away the ghosts, but I think it just makes them more visible. Julian's voice still hangs in the air from his final monologue, that speech about forgiveness and second chances that made half the audience reach for their tissues. His voice has deepened since we were boys, gained a richness that comes from years of training and performance, but underneath all that polish, I still hear the kid who used to practice Shakespeare in my basement, who could make Hamlet's soliloquies sound like prayers. During the curtain call, he scanned the audience like he was looking for someone, like he always used to do after our high school performances, searching the crowd until he found my parents in the third row, my mother clutching tissues, and my father trying to hide how proud he was. But tonight, when Julian's eyes swept across the theater, they found mine instead, and something passed between us that felt like recognition, like a question being asked after 20 years of silence. The moment stretched longer than it should have, long enough for the woman next to me to notice and follow his gaze, long enough for me to feel exposed under the stage lights that weren't even pointed in my direction. I didn't applaud. Couldn't make my hands move while my heart was doing that old familiar dance it used to do whenever Julian Blake entered a room. That rush of nervous energy and possibility that I spent years training myself to forget. The rest of the audience rose to their feet, a thunderous ovation that seemed to lift the very roof of the building. But I remained seated, frozen, watching him bow with that same graceful fluidity he'd had at 17. He soaked up the adoration that has always come so easily to him, that magnetic pull that drew people into his orbit without effort. He was brilliant and charismatic, and everything I remembered, everything I tried to forget, everything that made me fall in love with him when we were just boys who thought the whole world could fit inside a high school auditorium. The pocket of my jacket holds a letter I wrote 20 years ago and never sent. The paper is yellowed now, soft from handling. The ink slightly faded but still legible in my careful teacher's handwriting. 3 pages of everything I couldn't say out loud. Words I poured out the night before graduation while my parents slept and the rest of the world moved toward summer. I wrote it in my childhood bedroom, sitting at the desk where I'd done homework since middle school, surrounded by posters of Broadway shows and college acceptance letters I'd never respond to. The letter started as an apology and became a confession, began with explanations, and ended with a declaration of love so raw it still makes my chest tight to think about it. I don't know why I brought it tonight. Don't know why I keep it at all, folded small and hidden in a box of old scripts in my garage, buried under programs from shows we did together and photos from cast parties where we stand just a little too close, where my smile looks forced and Julian's arm around my shoulders feels like both a promise and a threat. Maybe because it's the most honest thing I've ever written, more truthful than my wedding vows or my teaching philosophy or any of the careful words I've used to build this respectable life. Maybe because it's proof that once, for just a moment, I was brave enough to tell the truth, even if I was too cowardly to share it. The truth is that Julian Blake was my first love, though I never said so. The truth is that we kissed exactly once, behind the chemistry building after the cast party for our town, and it changed the entire trajectory of my life. I can still remember every detail of that night. The way the spring air smelled like lilacs and possibility, the sound of laughter drifting from the party inside, the way Julian's hands shook when he reached for me. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, but those 10 seconds rewrote everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I wanted, about who I could become. The truth is that I watched him leave for New York 3 days after graduation and felt something inside me break, so cleanly it took years to heal crooked. I stood in my parents' driveway while he loaded his beat-up Subaru with everything he owned, and when he asked if I was really not coming, if I was really going to stay and teach high school theater instead of chasing dreams in the city, I just nodded. Couldn't tell him that watching him leave was breaking my heart. Couldn't explain that the kiss behind the chemistry building had terrified me more than any possibility of failure ever could. The truth is that I built my whole adult life around that break, choosing safety over possibility, choosing Hannah's steady love over the memory of Julian's wild heart, choosing a quiet existence in the town where we grew up over the uncertainty of a life that might have been extraordinary. Hannah was safe. Hannah was kind and practical and understood why I wanted to stay close to home, close to the familiar rhythms of small-town life. She never asked too many questions about my past, never pushed when I grew quiet during conversations about college or the friends I'd lost touch with. She accepted the version of myself I presented to her, responsible, dependable, slightly reserved. She never suspected that version was incomplete. I should have known he'd come back eventually. Success in New York theater is a rare and fragile thing, and Julian always had roots here, family obligations that would eventually call him home. His mother still lives on Elm Street, still tends the garden where Julian and I used to run lines among the tomato plants. Mrs. Blake always liked me, always said I was a good influence on her boy. She had no idea how wrong she was. Julian was the influence. Julian was the one who made me believe, for one brief shining semester, that I could be someone bigger than this small town would allow. The snow is falling now, thick and purposeful, the kind of snow that will accumulate quickly and transform the familiar landscape into something dreamlike and strange. I can see it through the tall windows that frame the lobby, fat flakes drifting past the streetlights like something from a snow globe, each one catching the light for just a moment before disappearing into the darkness. This is New Hampshire snow, the kind that settles heavy on pine branches and makes the whole world feel muffled and intimate. By tomorrow, the roads will be slick and treacherous, and everyone will move a little more carefully through their routines, scraping windshields and testing their footing on icy sidewalks. But tonight, the snow just makes everything feel hushed and expectant, like the world is holding its breath for something momentous to happen. It reminds me of the winter nights when Julian and I would walk home from rehearsals together, our voices echoing off the empty storefronts on Main Street, while we debated whether Chekhov was really as depressing as everyone said, or if there was hope hidden in all that melancholy. Julian always argued for hope. He had this way of finding light in the darkest stories, of making even tragedy feel like a form of celebration. He said that was what made theater worthwhile, the way it transformed suffering into something beautiful, something shared. The side door opens with a soft creak, and I slip out into the night without speaking to anyone. The cold hits my face like a slap, sharp and clean after the stuffy warmth of the theater. My car is parked under the same streetlight where I used to wait for Julian after rehearsals, and for a moment, time folds in on itself. I could be 17 again, standing here with my hands shoved deep in my pockets, watching my breath cloud in the frigid air while I work up the courage to ask if he wants to get coffee, if he wants to run lines, if he wants to do anything at all as long as it means we don't have to say goodnight yet. But I'm not 17. I'm 43, and my joints ache from sitting too long in those theater seats. And somewhere across town, Julian Blake is probably signing autographs and accepting congratulations from people who knew him when. People who can claim him easily, without the weight of history pressing down on their chests like a stone. I fumble for my keys with numb fingers, and that's when I hear it. His voice, not from the stage this time, but from memory. A line from that final scene we performed together in the spring of our senior year, when we played brothers torn apart by war and circumstance. He delivered it with such conviction that even now, 2 decades later, it echoes in my mind with perfect clarity. You never said goodbye. The accusation in those 4 words used to keep me awake at night. Because he was right. I never said goodbye. Instead, I said goodnight after our final performance, gave him a quick hug that lasted a second too long, and promised to keep in touch. Then I went home and wrote a letter I was too afraid to deliver, and 3 days later, he was gone. Standing here in the falling snow, with Julian Blake's voice echoing in my memory and that old letter burning a hole in my pocket, I realized that some goodbyes can't be avoided forever. They just get postponed, gathering weight like storm clouds, until the moment when the sky finally opens and everything you've been holding back comes pouring down at once. I unlock my car and sit behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine, watching my breath fog the windshield while the heater struggles to life. The theater grows smaller in my rearview mirror, but Julian's presence feels larger somehow, expanding to fill all the empty spaces I've been carrying around for 20 years. The spaces between what I said and what I meant, between who I am and who I might have been, between the safe choices I made and the dangerous ones I avoided. The drive home takes me past all the landmarks of our shared adolescence. The diner where we used to order coffee and pie after every opening night. The park where we'd run lines on summer evenings when the community center was too hot and stuffy. The intersection where Julian's street meets mine. I used to ride my bike to his house every day that summer before senior year, when we were preparing for our final show together. His mother would make us sandwiches and we'd sit in his basement, working through scenes with an intensity that felt almost religious. We were so young, so certain that we were part of something important, something that would matter beyond the boundaries of our small town. Tomorrow, I'll go back to my classroom and teach teenagers about dramatic structure and character motivation, about the importance of subtext and the power of what's left unsaid. I'll assign scenes from Romeo and Juliet and watch them giggle through the balcony scene. Too young to understand that some love stories are tragedies not because of external forces, but because of the choices people make when they're afraid. I'll come home to Hannah's pot roast and Micah's soccer practice, to homework help and bill paying, and all the small domestic rituals that make up a well-ordered life. I'll slip back into the careful routine I've built around the Julian-shaped hole in my life, the routine that's kept me safe and stable and profoundly lonely for longer than I care to admit. But tonight, driving through the snow toward my quiet house and my quiet life, with Julian Blake's voice still echoing in my memory and that old letter burning against my chest like a secret, I can't stop thinking about the way he looked at me during that curtain call. Like he was still waiting for an answer to a question I was too afraid to hear. like 20 years was nothing more than a pause between scenes, like the story we started together when we were 17 might not be over after all. The snow keeps falling, covering everything in white, making the familiar world look new again, and I wonder if some stories are patient enough to wait for their endings, even when the people living them think they've moved on to different plays entirely. The porch light is still on when I pull into our driveway, casting a warm yellow circle across the snow-covered steps. Hannah always leaves it burning when I'm out late, a small kindness that speaks to the consideration we've built our marriage on. Through the front window, I can see the blue glow of the television in our living room, probably tuned to one of those home renovation shows she watches before bed. The sight should comfort me, this evidence of a life well lived, of a woman who waits up to hear about my evening. Instead, it makes my chest feel tight, like I'm wearing a coat that no longer fits properly. I sit in the car for another moment, engine ticking as it cools, and try to arrange my face into something resembling normalcy. Hannah will ask how the show went, whether the new director did justice to the script, if any of my former students were in the cast. She'll pour me a cup of chamomile tea and curl up beside me on the couch, waiting for stories I won't know how to tell. How do I explain that watching Julian Blake on stage felt like watching a ghost of my former self, like seeing all the roads I didn't take converging in one brilliant, impossible moment? The house greets me with its familiar warmth, radiators humming their steady song, and the lingering scent of whatever Hannah made for dinner. Beef stew, probably, or that chicken casserole Micah actually eats without complaining. The hallway walls are lined with framed photographs chronicling our 15 years together. Wedding pictures where we both look impossibly young, vacation snapshots from trips to the White Mountains and Cape Cod, school photos of Micah growing from gap-toothed kindergartner to the serious 15-year-old he is now. In every picture, we look like exactly what we are, a nice family, stable and content, the kind of people who attend PTA meetings and remember to send Christmas cards. Hannah appears in the kitchen doorway wearing her favorite flannel pajamas, the ones with the faded pattern of coffee cups that I gave her 3 Christmases ago. Her graying hair is pulled back in the loose ponytail she wears to bed, and she's holding 2 mugs of tea, steam rising between us like a question. "How was it?" she asks, and I take the offered mug, grateful for something to do with my hands. The tea tastes like chamomile and honey, like safety and routine, and all the small comforts of a predictable life. It was good, I tell her. Professional. The new director really knew what she was doing. Hannah settles beside me on the couch, tucking her feet under her in that way she's done since we were dating. She doesn't ask about Julian specifically, though I'm certain she saw his name in the program when she glanced at it this morning. She's always been tactful that way, careful not to probe too deeply into corners of my past that I've never fully illuminated. It's one of the things I love about her, this respect for the spaces between people, but tonight it feels like distance rather than consideration. We talk about practical things, Micah's upcoming chemistry test, the estimate we're waiting on for the roof repair, her mother's persistent cough that might require another doctor's visit. Our conversation moves through these topics with the efficiency of people who have learned to communicate in schedules and obligations rather than feelings and dreams. It's not unkind, this exchange of information. It's simply what our marriage has become over the years, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared responsibilities rather than the kind of passion that burns bright and dangerous. After Hannah goes to bed, I find myself wandering through the quiet house like a stranger in my own life. In the living room, my gaze settles on the piano that sits against the far wall, its dark wood surface scattered with the detritus of daily life. Micah's calculus textbook, a stack of bills waiting to be paid, one of Hannah's coffee mugs forming a ring on the finish. I used to play, back in high school, well enough to accompany Julian when he practiced songs for auditions. My fingers would find the melody while his voice soared above, filling whatever space we occupied with music that made everything else disappear. I haven't touched those keys in years. Can't remember the last time I heard music in this house that wasn't coming from Micah's headphones or Hannah's morning radio. We bought the piano when we first moved in, full of intentions about family sing-alongs and holiday gatherings where someone would play carols while everyone else gathered around. But good intentions and real life don't always align, and gradually the piano became just another piece of furniture, another surface to collect the accumulation of our days. Micah's room is at the top of the stairs, his door slightly ajar, spilling a thin line of light into the hallway. At 15, he's caught in that strange space between childhood and whatever comes next, his body shooting up so fast that he seems to be constantly growing out of his clothes. He has Hannah's practical nature, but my tendency toward introspection, which means he spends a lot of time thinking about things he doesn't yet have words for. Lately, he's been distant in the way teenagers often are, but there's something else beneath the surface, a restlessness that reminds me uncomfortably of myself at his age. I knock softly and push the door open to find him at his desk, chemistry textbooks spread open in front of him, but his attention fixed on something on his phone screen. When he looks up, I see Hannah's brown eyes and my own stubborn chin, genetics arranging themselves into a face that's becoming more familiar and more foreign every day. "Dad," he says, and there's surprise in his voice, as if he's not used to me seeking him out at this hour. "How was the show?" It's the same question Hannah asked, but when Micah says it, I hear genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. He's always been interested in theater in an abstract way, not enough to audition for the school plays, but enough to ask thoughtful questions about the productions I direct. Sometimes I catch him watching me during those conversations, like he's trying to solve a puzzle he doesn't fully understand. "It was well done," I tell him, settling on the edge of his bed. The lead actor was someone I knew in high school, Julian Blake. He's made quite a career for himself in New York. Micah nods, storing this information away in whatever filing system teenagers use to categorize their parents' mysterious histories. He asks if Julian was good back then too, and I find myself telling him about the time Julian played Hamlet in our senior year production, how he made the famous soliloquy feel like a conversation rather than a performance, how the entire audience seemed to hold its breath during his scenes. "You never talk about high school much," Micah observes, and the comment catches me off guard with its perceptiveness. It's true, I realize. I've edited those years down to the safest stories, the ones that don't require explanation or context that might lead to uncomfortable questions. It was a long time ago, I say, but even as the words leave my mouth, they feel inadequate. Tonight has made high school feel immediate and present, like something that happened yesterday rather than 2 decades ago. After saying goodnight to Micah, I wander back downstairs and pour myself a whiskey, something I rarely do but feels necessary tonight. The house settles around me with its familiar creaks and sighs, and I find myself drawn to the kitchen window that looks out over our backyard. In the summer, Hannah tends a small garden there, tomatoes and herbs, and the kind of practical vegetables that make good sense in New England soil. But now everything is buried under snow, reduced to gentle mounds and shadows that could be anything at all. The garage calls to me like a dare I've been avoiding for years. It's where we keep the practical detritus of suburban life, lawn mower and snow blower, paint cans from various home improvement projects, boxes of Christmas decorations that see daylight once a year. But in the far corner, behind Hannah's exercise bike and a stack of Micah's outgrown sports equipment, there's a cardboard box I haven't opened since we moved to this house 15 years ago. The whiskey makes me brave, or maybe just foolish. I pull on my jacket and boots and make my way through the snow to the garage, my footsteps the only sound in the crystalline night. The box is exactly where I left it, labeled in my careful handwriting, Elliot, high school. Such an innocuous description for something that feels so dangerous to touch. Inside, the past is preserved like artifacts from an archaeological dig. Programs from every show we did together, cast photos where Julian and I stand close enough that our shoulders touch, ticket stubs from the professional productions we drove to Boston to see. There are scripts, too, dog-eared copies of everything from our town to A Midsummer Night's Dream. Their margins filled with notes in 2 different kinds of handwriting. Mine, neat and precise, noting blocking and character motivation. Julian's, wild and sprawling, full of questions and observations that go far beyond what any director asked for. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in an old t-shirt like something precious, is a cassette tape with no label. My hands shake slightly as I dig out the old boombox from behind some paint cans, the one we used to use for rehearsals back when school still had equipment that old. It takes 3 tries to get the tape to play, and when Julian's voice finally emerges from the speakers, it hits me like a physical blow. The recording is from our final performance together, the spring play that closed just 3 days before graduation. We performed it in the round, with the audience surrounding us on all sides, creating an intimacy that made every whispered line feel like a secret shared. Julian played my brother in the script, the charming one who always got into trouble, while I was the responsible older sibling trying to hold everything together. Art imitating life, or maybe the other way around. His voice on the tape is younger than it was tonight, rougher around the edges, but already carrying that quality that made people lean forward in their seats. The scene playing is our final one together, where my character finally confronts his brother about all the things they've never said to each other. Julian delivers his lines with a vulnerability that still makes my breath catch. And then comes the moment I've been dreading and hoping for. "Why does your silence sound like goodbye?" he says. And even through the tinny speakers of an old cassette player, 20 years later, sitting alone in my garage while my family sleeps, the words land with the force of an accusation. Because I hear my own voice responding, steady and sure in a way I've never managed in real life. Because some things are too important for words. It's just dialogue from a script, lines written by someone else about fictional brothers and their fictional problems. But listening to it now, I remember the way Julian looked at me during that final performance, how the scripted words seemed to carry the weight of everything we couldn't say to each other in real life. I remember how the audience disappeared during that scene, how it felt like there was no one in the world except the two of us, and the truth hanging in the air between us like a challenge. The tape keeps playing, but I'm no longer listening to the words. Instead, I'm remembering what happened after the curtain fell that night, how Julian grabbed my hand during the curtain call and held it just a moment longer than the script required, how we walked to the cast party together, still high on adrenaline and the peculiar sadness that comes at the end of things, how we ended up behind the chemistry building, away from the noise and laughter, talking about college and the future and all the ways our lives were about to diverge. I've spent 20 years trying to forget what happened next, but tonight, with Julian's voice filling my cold garage and the snow falling outside like a benediction, I let myself remember the moment when talking stopped being enough. When Julian stepped closer and I didn't step away. When he said my name like a question and I answered by kissing him, soft and desperate, and full of all the words I'd never been brave enough to speak. 10 seconds that changed everything. 10 seconds that I've spent 2 decades trying to pretend didn't matter, even as they shaped every decision I made afterward. I turn off the tape player and sit in the silence, surrounded by the ghosts of who we used to be, and finally admit to myself what I've always known. I never stopped loving Julian Blake. I just got very, very good at pretending otherwise. 3 weeks pass before the phone call changes everything. 3 weeks of ordinary February mornings scraping ice from my windshield, of teaching Macbeth to sophomores who can't understand why anyone would kill for a crown, of family dinners where Hannah talks about her book club and Micah pushes peas around his plate while texting someone under the table. 3 weeks of pretending that listening to that old tape didn't crack something fundamental inside me, that I can simply return to the careful routine I've spent 2 decades perfecting. But some discoveries can't be undone. Since that night in the garage, I catch myself listening for Julian's voice in every crowded room, scanning faces at the grocery store and coffee shop for features that might belong to him. Hannah asks twice if I'm feeling well, and Micah mentions that I seem distracted during our usual Sunday morning pancake ritual. They're not wrong. I am distracted, unmoored, like someone who's been sleepwalking for 20 years and suddenly found himself wide awake in the middle of an unfamiliar landscape. The call comes on a Tuesday afternoon while I'm grading essays about symbolism in Death of a Salesman. My desk is covered with student papers, each one a variation on the same basic insights about the American dream and its discontents, when my phone buzzes with a number I don't immediately recognize. "Mr. Monroe," the voice says, and it takes me a moment to place it. This is Sarah Chun. I was in your drama class maybe 8 years ago. I played Emily in our town my senior year. I remember Sarah, bright and earnest with a voice that could fill the auditorium without effort. She went on to study arts administration at UNH, one of the few students who managed to turn her theater passion into something practical and sustainable. The surprise in my voice is genuine when I ask how she's been, what she's doing these days. She's working for the New Hampshire Arts Council now, she explains, helping coordinate community outreach programs across the state. Which brings her to the reason for her call. The Riverside Community Theater wants to do a benefit production this spring, something to raise money for high school drama programs that have been hit hard by budget cuts. They need someone with educational experience to co-direct, someone who understands both the artistic and administrative sides of school theater. Would you be interested? She asks, and I find myself saying yes before I've fully processed what she's asking. Maybe it's the enthusiasm in her voice, or maybe it's the way the question arrives exactly when I've been questioning everything about my carefully constructed life. Either way, the word escapes before my rational mind can intervene. The play is The Glass Menagerie. She continues, Tennessee Williams' memory play about a family trapped by their own dreams and disappointments. It's perfect for a benefit because it only requires 4 actors, which keeps costs down, but it's substantial enough to draw a real audience. They already have someone lined up for Tom, the narrator, a local actor who's been doing some professional work in New York. My heart stops before she says his name, some instinct warning me that the universe is about to reveal its sense of humor. Julian Blake, she says, and the words land like a physical blow. He grew up here. You probably knew him in school. He's been doing really well for himself, off-Broadway shows, some television work. He even had a recurring role on one of those streaming series for a while. The rational response would be to withdraw gracefully, to invent a scheduling conflict or family obligation that makes participation impossible. Instead, I hear myself asking about rehearsal schedules and performance dates, my voice steady even as my hands start to shake. Sarah sounds delighted, probably interpreting my questions as professional interest rather than the careful probing of someone trying to determine whether he's about to walk voluntarily into the fire that's been burning quietly in his chest for 20 years. 2 weeks later, I find myself standing in the basement of the Unitarian Church on Elm Street, the same space where Julian and I rehearsed summer productions when we were teenagers. The room smells like coffee and old hymnals, with folding chairs arranged in a rough approximation of a rehearsal space, and a few music stands serving as makeshift set pieces. It's exactly the kind of low-budget, high-ambition setup that defines community theater, the sort of environment where passion has to substitute for resources and everyone involved has to believe that what they're creating matters despite its limitations. The cast is small but enthusiastic. Margaret Whitman, a retired English teacher who's been acting in local productions for 30 years, cast as Amanda, the faded Southern belle whose dreams for her children exceed their capabilities. Danny Russo, a college sophomore home for spring break, playing Jim, the gentleman caller whose arrival sets the play's climax in motion. Laura will be played by Emma Santos, a shy high school senior whose audition apparently moved everyone to tears. And then there's the empty chair where Julian Blake should be sitting. Sarah introduces me to the group as their co-director, explaining that I'll be focusing primarily on working with the younger actors while she handles the overall production management. The arrangement suits me perfectly, giving me something specific to focus on rather than the generalized anxiety of simply being in the same room as Julian again. Emma looks terrified in the way that talented young actors often do when they realize they've gotten exactly what they wanted, so I settle into the chair beside her and start asking gentle questions about her experience with Williams, whether she's read any of his other plays, what drew her to audition for Laura. She's in the middle of explaining her senior project on disability representation in American drama when the basement door opens and Julian Blake walks into my life again. He's late, of course. Julian was always late to everything in high school, not from disrespect, but from the kind of intense focus that made him lose track of time when he was working on something that mattered to him. He appears at the bottom of the stairs carrying a coffee cup and a worn leather messenger bag, apologizing to the room in general while scanning for an empty chair. He looks older, obviously, but the intervening years have been kind to him. His dark hair is shorter now, professionally styled rather than the unruly mop he wore in high school, and there are lines around his eyes that speak to someone who laughs often and genuinely. He's dressed like someone who makes his living in New York theaters. Dark jeans, worn-in boots, a sweater that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, but looks like he's owned it forever. The room comes alive when he enters, conversations becoming more animated, laughter coming easier. It's the same magnetic pull he had at 17, that quality that made people want to be near him, to bask in whatever light he was throwing off. Margaret immediately launches into questions about his recent projects, and Danny starts talking about this showcase he saw in Boston, where Julian apparently did a scene from Streetcar that left everyone speechless. I watched this reunion unfold from my corner chair, trying to make myself invisible while simultaneously memorizing every detail of his presence. The way he gestures when he talks, hands moving to illustrate points that don't require illustration. The way his laugh starts in his chest and works its way up until it fills whatever space he's occupying. The way he says everyone's name like he's genuinely happy to meet them, like each introduction is a small gift he's being offered. And then Sarah mentions that I'm their co-director, and Julian's attention turns to me for the first time in 20 years. The moment stretches longer than it should, the room growing quiet around us, while something passes between us that feels both inevitable and impossible. His eyes are the same green they always were, though now they carry the weight of experience that comes from actually living the dreams we used to share. When he smiles, it's the careful smile of someone who's learned to be guarded, but underneath it I catch a glimpse of the boy who used to practice Shakespeare's soliloquies in my basement. "Elliot Monroe," he says, extending his hand like we're strangers meeting for the first time. His voice carries just the slightest trace of an accent he didn't have in high school, something he probably picked up during his years in the city. "I heard you were teaching now. Drama, right?" I shake his hand and try to ignore the way my pulse jumps at the contact, the way his fingers linger against mine for just a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Just Elliot is fine," I tell him, falling into the same careful politeness he's offering. "And yes, at the high school. Been there about 15 years now." The conversation that follows is a masterpiece of subtext. Two people who once knew each other's thoughts now speaking entirely in euphemisms and careful omissions. He asks about my family, and I mention Hannah and Micah without going into detail about how we met or why I stayed in town. I ask about his work, and he talks about recent projects without mentioning why he decided to come back for a small community theater production in the place he spent most of his 20s trying to escape. Neither of us mentions the last conversation we had, standing in his driveway while he loaded his car with everything he owned. Neither of us acknowledges that we recognized each other immediately despite the 20 years that have passed. Neither of us says anything about the way the air in the room seems to have changed, become charged with the kind of electricity that makes everyone else unconsciously lean forward like they're trying to catch pieces of a conversation happening in frequencies they can't quite hear. Sarah calls for our first read-through, and we arrange ourselves in a circle with scripts in our laps, and the peculiar nervous energy that marks the beginning of any theatrical collaboration. Julian settles into the chair directly across from me, close enough that I can smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that probably has a name like Midnight in Tuscany or Brooklyn Rain. The Glass Menagerie is a memory play, narrated by Tom Wingfield as he looks back on the events that led to his abandoning his family in search of adventure and escape. Julian reads the opening monologue with a restraint that surprises me, none of the theatrical flourishes I remember from our high school days. Instead, he finds the melancholy beneath William's lyrical language, the weight of someone carrying 20 years of regret and trying to make sense of the choices that brought him to this moment of looking backward. As we work through the scenes, I find myself watching him with the kind of professional attention I usually reserve for my students, noting the choices he makes and the way he approaches the text. But underneath that pedagogical focus runs a current of something more personal, a recognition that goes beyond craft or technique. This is the same person who used to find emotional truth in everything he read, who could make even the most overwrought dialogue feel honest and immediate. When we break for coffee, the group naturally fragments into smaller conversations, and I find myself standing near the refreshment table with Julian, both of us pretending to be very interested in the selection of store-bought cookies while the rest of the cast discusses blocking for the opening scene. "You still take your coffee black," he observes, and the comment hits me like a small electric shock. It's such an insignificant detail, the kind of thing you only notice if you've spent time watching someone else's daily rituals. But it carries the weight of intimacy across 20 years of distance. "Some things don't change," I tell him, and immediately regret how that might sound, what implications he might read into such a simple statement. He nods thoughtfully, stirring cream into his own cup with the kind of careful attention people use when they're thinking about something else entirely. After a moment, he asks about my teaching, whether I miss performing, if I ever think about what might have happened if I'd made different choices after graduation. The questions feel dangerous, full of landmines that could explode into territory neither of us is prepared to navigate in a church basement surrounded by other people. So I give him safe answers, talking about the satisfaction of working with young actors, the way teaching keeps you connected to the material even when you're not on stage yourself, the particular pleasure of watching students discover things about themselves through the process of becoming someone else. But while I'm offering these careful responses, I'm studying his face for clues about what he really wants to know, what he's really asking underneath the polite small talk. There's something in his expression that reminds me of the way he used to look during our most intense scene work, like he's listening for subtext, for the meaning beneath the words I'm actually saying. The conversation continues through several more rehearsals, always in these stolen moments between official business, always careful and coded, but gradually becoming more personal. He tells me about his apartment in Brooklyn, a fourth-floor walk-up with thin walls and a view of a fire escape, but also about the coffee shop on the corner where he writes in the mornings and the little theater in Queens where he sometimes helps with new play development. I find myself sharing stories about Micah, about the particular challenges of parenting a teenager who seems to be growing more independent every day, about Hannah's work at the library and the book club that meets in our living room once a month. These conversations feel like careful archaeology, two people excavating the layers of their separate lives to find the place where they diverged, the moment when the path they might have traveled together became two paths leading in different directions. Neither of us mentions that moment directly, but it hovers between us like a question that hasn't been asked yet. It's during our third rehearsal that Julian starts calling me Monroe, the nickname he used in high school when we were running lines or working late in the scene shop. The first time he says it, I'm explaining something about William's use of memory as a dramatic device, and the familiar name stops me mid-sentence. He continues as if nothing has happened, but I catch him watching my reaction, noting the way the old nickname lands between us like a bridge thrown across 20 years of distance. After that, the nickname becomes his standard way of addressing me, casual and easy, like we're still 17 and the world is full of possibilities we haven't yet failed to pursue. The rest of the cast doesn't seem to notice, but for me, every time he says Monroe, it feels like a small act of rebellion against the careful politeness we've been maintaining. One evening after everyone else has left, we find ourselves alone in the basement, stacking chairs and turning off lights while talking about the upcoming scene between Tom and Laura, the moment when the brother finally admits that he's planning to leave. That staying is slowly killing him. Julian mentions that he's been thinking about motivation, about what drives someone to abandon the people they love in pursuit of something they can't even name. It's not really about the play anymore, this conversation. We both know that Williams wrote Tom as a version of himself, that the whole piece is an exercise in guilt and justification, an attempt to make sense of the choice to prioritize art over obligation. But standing in that empty basement with Julian, surrounded by folded chairs and the lingering smell of coffee, the parallels to our own story feel too obvious to ignore. I'm the one who finally says it, the thing we've been dancing around for weeks. You left, I tell him, and the words come out more quietly than I intended, barely above a whisper in the echoing space. He stops what he's doing, a chair half folded in his hands, and looks at me with an expression I can't quite read. For a long moment, the only sound is the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of traffic on Main Street. Yes, he says finally. I did. Another pause, longer this time, full of all the questions neither of us is brave enough to ask. Then he adds, almost so quietly I have to strain to hear him, but I never really left. Not the town. You. The admission hangs between us like something fragile and dangerous, and I realize that everything we've been building toward over these weeks of careful conversation and loaded glances has been leading to this moment. All the polite small talk and professional collaboration has been preparation for this confession, this acknowledgement that some things don't diminish with time or distance. I don't know how to respond to such honesty, so I don't try. Instead, I finish stacking the chairs in silence while Julian gathers the scripts and turns off the remaining lights. We walk to our cars together without speaking, but the weight of what he said follows us into the cold March air, where it settles between us like snow, covering the familiar landscape of our friendship with something new and uncertain and full of possibility. Something shifts after Julian's confession in the church basement, like a door that's been locked for 20 years suddenly swinging open to let in light and air and the possibility of things I thought I'd buried forever. The next rehearsal feels different from the moment I walk into the room. Julian arrives on time, which itself is unusual, and when our eyes meet across the circle of folding chairs, he doesn't look away. Instead, he offers me a small smile that carries none of the careful politeness we've been maintaining, just the kind of quiet acknowledgement that passes between people who've decided to stop pretending they don't see each other. We're working on the scene where Tom talks about his job at the warehouse, about feeling trapped in a life that's slowly suffocating him, while his dreams of adventure and escape grow stronger every day. Julian approaches the monologue differently than he has before, finding a rawness in the text that makes everyone in the room lean forward. When he delivers the line about being stuck in a coffin of his own making, his eyes find mine, and I understand that he's not just playing Tom Wingfield anymore. He's talking about the 20 years he spent trying to convince himself that leaving was the right choice, that pursuing his dreams in New York was worth the price of abandoning everything he'd left behind. After the scene ends, Sarah suggests we take a short break, but Julian asks if we can work through it once more. He wants to try something different. He says, maybe find another layer in Tom's relationship with his memories. I find myself offering to read with him, to help him explore the scene from different angles, even though that's not really part of my role as co-director. We move to the corner of the basement, away from the others, and run through the monologue again. This time, Julian delivers it not to an imaginary audience, but directly to me, his voice low and intimate like he's sharing secrets in the dark. The words Williams wrote about memory and regret and the impossible weight of choices become something more personal, a conversation between two people who understand exactly what it feels like to be haunted by the roads not taken. When he finishes, neither of us speaks for a moment. The basement suddenly feels too small, the air charged with the kind of electricity that makes my hands shake when I reach for my coffee cup. Julian's looking at me like he's waiting for something, some response or acknowledgement that what just passed between us was more than just scene work. That was better, I managed to say, my voice steadier than I feel. More honest. He nods, but doesn't move away, and for a heartbeat, I think he might say something else, might push this conversation into territory we haven't mapped yet. Instead, he just murmurs my name, Elliot, not Monroe this time, and the sound of it in his voice makes something inside my chest flutter like a bird trying to escape. The following weeks develop a rhythm that feels both familiar and entirely new. We begin staying after rehearsals to work on scenes, just the two of us in the basement while the rest of the cast disperses to their regular lives. Julian brings a thermos of coffee that actually tastes good, not the church basement swill we usually drink, and we sit cross-legged on the floor with scripts spread between us, discussing motivation and subtext, and the particular challenges of performing Williams in a space designed for potluck dinners rather than theatrical magic. These late-night sessions become the center of my week, the thing I find myself looking forward to during the long afternoons of teaching teenagers who can't understand why anyone would care about metaphors in Macbeth. Julian has ideas about the play that I never would have considered, insights that come from years of working with professional directors and really good actors. He talks about Williams' use of light as memory, about the way the past bleeds into the present until it becomes impossible to tell which moments are real and which are reconstructed from longing and guilt. But it's not just the intellectual discussion that draws me back week after week. It's the way Julian listens when I talk, like every word matters, like my thoughts about theater and teaching and life in general are worth the kind of attention I haven't received in years. It's the way he laughs at my observations about small-town dynamics, the way he asks follow-up questions that show he's actually hearing what I'm saying rather than just waiting for his turn to speak. Gradually, our conversations extend beyond the basement walls. We start walking to our cars together, then standing by the driver's side doors talking for another 20 minutes about everything and nothing. The March air is still cold enough to see our breath, but spring is beginning to assert itself in small ways. The snow melting into dirty slush, the days growing incrementally longer, the smell of earth starting to emerge from beneath the winter's accumulation. One evening, Julian suggests we walk the long way to the parking lot, down Main Street toward the river where we used to go after rehearsals in high school. The route takes us past storefronts that have changed hands multiple times since we were teenagers, past the diner where we used to order coffee and pie after opening nights, past the bookstore where Julian bought his first copy of Death of a Salesman because he wanted to understand why Arthur Miller made such different choices than Tennessee Williams. Walking beside him feels like slipping into muscle memory, like my body remembers exactly how to match his pace. When a pause for him to finish a thought, how much space to leave between us as we navigate the uneven sidewalks. We talk about the changes in town, about which businesses have survived and which have been replaced by chain stores and trendy cafes that cater to the tourists who come through on their way to ski resorts further north. But underneath these safe topics runs an undercurrent of something more personal, a recognition that we're retracing steps we took 20 years ago when the future felt infinite and terrifying and full of possibility. Julian mentions the apartment he's renting for the duration of rehearsals, a furnished place above the bakery on Elm Street that belongs to Mrs. Peterson, who taught us both in freshman English and probably doesn't remember that Julian Blake was the boy who turned in a 10-page analysis of Romeo and Juliet that she kept as an example for future classes. These walks become part of our routine, and as the weather warms, they stretch longer, sometimes lasting until the streetlights come on and I realize I should have been home an hour ago. Hannah never complains about my late nights, just asks how rehearsals are going and whether I think the production will be ready by opening night. But I catch her watching me sometimes, studying my face like she's trying to solve a puzzle she didn't know existed. The changes in my daily life start small and spread outward like ripples in still water. I find myself humming while I shave in the mornings, songs I haven't thought about in years that surface from some deep place where Julian's voice has been echoing all this time. I start wearing the blue sweater that Hannah gave me for Christmas 3 years ago, but I've never put on because it seemed too bright, too noticeable for someone who spent decades perfecting the art of blending into the background. My teaching changes too, becomes more animated, more passionate. I catch myself telling stories about theatrical history that go beyond what's required by the curriculum, sharing anecdotes about famous actors and legendary productions that make my students lean forward in their seats. During lunch duty, I sit at the piano in the music room and discover that my fingers still remember chord progressions I learned 25 years ago, melodies that emerge from muscle memory like gifts I forgot I'd given myself. Micah notices first. We're eating breakfast on a Saturday morning, just the two of us because Hannah is at her monthly volunteer shift at the animal shelter, when he comments that I seem different lately. More awake, he says, which is such a perceptive observation that I nearly choke on my coffee. I ask him what he means, And he shrugs in that way teenagers do when they're trying to articulate something they feel but can't quite name. You're just more here, he says. Like you're actually paying attention to stuff instead of just going through the motions. The comment stays with me for days, partly because it's so accurate and partly because I didn't realize how much of my life I've been sleepwalking through until I started waking up. That evening, while Hannah is grading papers at the kitchen table and Micah is upstairs doing homework, I find myself telling them both about the old theater days. Not everything. Not the parts that would require explanations I'm not ready to give, but stories about the productions we did and the teachers who inspired us and the particular magic of live performance when everything comes together perfectly. Micah listens with the kind of attention he usually reserves for video games, asking questions about specific plays and whether I ever miss being on stage myself. Hannah contributes memories of her own high school theater experiences, and for a moment we feel like a family that actually talks to each other rather than simply exchanging information about schedules and obligations. Later, after Micah has gone to bed, Hannah asks if I've been in touch with anyone from back then. There's something in her voice, not suspicion exactly, but the careful tone people use when they're approaching territory that might be sensitive. An old friend, I tell her, which is both true and completely inadequate. We're working on this production together. She nods and returns to her papers, but I catch her watching me over the stack of essays, studying my face like she's trying to identify exactly what's changed and whether she should be worried about it. The truth is that everything is changing, sometimes in ways so subtle I don't notice until after the fact, sometimes so dramatically that I feel like I'm becoming a different person entirely. Colors seem more vivid, like someone has adjusted the saturation on my life. Music carries more weight, whether it's the classical station Hannah plays during dinner or the rock songs leaking from Micah's headphones. Even food tastes different, more complex, like I've been eating with diminished senses for years, and suddenly everything has flavor again. It's during our 5th week of rehearsals that Julian suggests we grab a drink after we finish working on the climactic scene between Tom and Laura. There's a new wine bar that opened where the old hardware store used to be, he says, the kind of place that serves cheese plates and plays jazz so quietly you can actually have a conversation. But when we get there, the bar is crowded with college students home for spring break. The music turned up loud enough to make intimate conversation impossible. Julian looks disappointed, and without really thinking about it, I offer an alternative. My place is too complicated, too full of family photos and evidence of the life I've built without him. But Julian's apartment is neutral territory, temporary space that doesn't carry the weight of 20 years of accumulated history. He hesitates for just a moment, and I wonder if he's thinking the same thing I am. That being alone together in private space feels like crossing a line we've been carefully avoiding. But then he nods and gives me directions to the apartment above Peterson's Bakery, tells me to park around back and come up the outside stairs so we don't have to walk through the shop. The apartment is exactly what I expected and nothing like I imagined. It's small and cluttered in the way that suggests someone who lives fully in temporary spaces. Every surface covered with the kind of objects that reveal personality rather than decorating philosophy. There are books everywhere, not arranged on shelves but stacked on tables and chairs and windowsills, plays and novels and poetry collections that look well-read rather than decorative. The walls are covered with photographs and posters from productions he's been in, promotional materials from off-Broadway shows mixed with candid shots of cast parties and backstage moments. It's an actor's nest, I realize, the kind of space that exists to support the real work that happens elsewhere, in rehearsal rooms and on stages, and in the imaginary worlds created by other people's words. But it's also unmistakably Julian's space, full of the same restless energy that always surrounded him, the sense that he's always in motion even when he's standing still. He pours us each a glass of wine from a bottle he produces from a kitchen that's barely large enough for one person. Something red and expensive-looking that probably cost more than I usually spend on alcohol in a month. We settle on the couch, a piece of furniture that's clearly been borrowed from someone else's life, and for the first time since we started working together, we don't talk about the play. Instead, Julian asks about my writing, whether I still work on my own material or if teaching has consumed all my creative energy. The question catches me off guard because I'd forgotten I ever told him about the plays I used to write in college. One acts about small-town life and family dysfunction that probably weren't very good, but felt important when I was writing them. I haven't written anything in years, I admit. Not since Micah was small, and every spare moment was consumed by diapers and sleepless nights, and the overwhelming responsibility of keeping another human being alive and happy. Julian nods like this makes perfect sense, but then he asks if I ever think about starting again, whether there are stories I want to tell now that I understand more about life and loss and the particular weight of middle age. The wine makes me honest in ways I usually avoid, and I find myself talking about the plays I watch my students perform, how I sometimes see myself in their earnest attempts to become someone else through the magic of performance. I tell him about the moments in my classroom when literature comes alive for a student who's never cared about books before, how teaching can feel like its own form of artistic expression when everything comes together properly. He listens without interrupting, occasionally asking questions that show he's really hearing what I'm saying, and gradually I realize that this is the longest conversation I've had about my inner life in years. Hannah and I talk about practical things, logistics and schedules, and the daily maintenance of family life. With my colleagues at school, conversation rarely ventures beyond professional concerns. But Julian is asking about dreams and aspirations, and the parts of myself I've learned to keep private. The evening slips away while we talk, the wine bottle growing lighter as our conversation grows deeper. Julian tells me about the loneliness of actor life in New York, how you can be surrounded by people who understand your work but still feel fundamentally isolated, like you're performing even when you're not on stage. He describes auditions that felt perfect but led nowhere, callbacks that seemed promising until they weren't, the particular rejection that comes from having your interpretation of a character dismissed by people who never bothered to learn your name. But he also talks about the moments when it all works, when you find the truth in a scene and feel it resonate through the audience like electricity, when the artificial boundaries between performer and observer dissolve and everyone in the room is sharing the same emotional experience. Those moments make everything else worthwhile, he says, all the rejection and uncertainty and financial instability. As the night deepens, our conversation becomes more personal, more confessional. Julian talks about relationships that failed because he could never quite commit to staying in one place, about the apartment in Brooklyn that never felt like home because home was always somewhere else, somewhere he'd left behind and couldn't quite return to. I find myself sharing things I never intended to say out loud, about the way marriage can become comfortable but distant, about loving your child while feeling like you don't quite understand who he's becoming, about the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who know you well but don't really see you. Somewhere during this exchange, we move closer together on the couch, not deliberately, but in the way that happens when conversation becomes intimate and physical space starts to mirror emotional proximity. Julian's knee is almost touching mine, and when he leans forward to make a point, I catch the scent of his cologne mixed with wine and something else that's just distinctly him. The record player in the corner has been cycling through albums all evening, jazz and folk and classical pieces that create a soundtrack for our conversation without overwhelming it. But when Miles Davis starts playing something slow and melancholy, Julian gets up to change the music, and I watch him move through the small space with the same unconscious grace he's always had. He puts on something I don't recognize, a singer with a voice like velvet performing songs that sound like they were written for late nights and wine and conversations that matter. When he returns to the couch, he sits closer than before, close enough that I can see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, close enough that when he says my name it feels like a caress. "Elliot," he says, and there's something in his voice that makes my breath catch. A quality I remember from 20 years ago when we were boys trying to figure out what we meant to each other. The moment stretches between us, full of possibility and danger and all the things we haven't said to each other yet. Julian leans forward slightly, and I can see the question in his eyes, the invitation that's being offered so carefully I could pretend I don't understand it if I need to preserve my safety. But instead of answering, Instead of moving toward him or away, I freeze. 20 years of careful choices and safe decisions rise up like a wall between us, and I can't make myself move past them. The wine has made me honest but not brave, and when Julian whispers my name again like a prayer, like a promise, I pull back. I should go, I say, the words coming out harder than I intended. Hannah will be wondering where I am. Julian's face doesn't change, but something in his eyes shifts, disappointment or understanding or maybe just resignation. He nods and helps me find my jacket, walks me to the door like a polite host ending an evening that went on longer than planned. But at the top of the stairs, just before I head down to my car, he touches my arm and says something that follows me all the way home. You don't have to pretend with me, Elliot. Not anymore. The next day, hidden in my script like a secret, I find a note written in Julian's familiar handwriting. The same words he spoke on the stairs, written on a piece of paper torn from one of the notebooks scattered around his apartment. You don't have to pretend with me. I fold the note carefully and slip it into my wallet, next to the letter I wrote 20 years ago and never sent, and wonder how long I can keep living in the space between who I am and who I might have been if I'd been braver when it mattered most. The note stays in my wallet for 2 weeks, folded next to the letter I wrote 20 years ago, 2 pieces of paper that represent 20 years of things unsaid. Julian and I continue our careful dance around each other during rehearsals, professional and cordial, but the air between us has changed. Every glance carries weight, every casual conversation feels loaded with subtext, and I catch myself studying his hands when he gestures, remembering the way his fingers felt against my arm that night on the stairs. We don't talk about what almost happened in his apartment, but it hovers between us like a promise or a threat, depending on how brave I'm feeling on any given day. The other cast members seem oblivious to the undercurrent, focused as they are on memorizing lines and blocking, on the 1,000 small details that make a production come together. But I sometimes catch Sarah watching us with the shrewd attention of someone who spent years managing artistic personalities, like she can sense that something is shifting in the dynamic even if she can't identify exactly what. The play itself is coming together beautifully. Margaret has found layers in Amanda Wingfield that make the character tragic rather than simply pathetic, and Danny brings a genuine warmth to Jim that makes his eventual retreat feel heartbreaking rather than cruel. Emma has surprised everyone, including herself, by discovering a steely core beneath Laura's apparent fragility, playing the disability not as weakness but as a different way of moving through the world. And Julian is magnificent as Tom, finding the perfect balance between nostalgia and regret, between the young man who left and the older one looking back with 20 years of perspective. He delivers William's poetic language like it's conversation, makes the memory play feel immediate and urgent rather than sentimental. During our final dress rehearsal, watching him inhabit Tom Wingfield so completely, I understand why he's been successful in New York, why directors keep calling him back despite the competitive impossibility of making a living in theater. The dress rehearsal takes place on a Thursday evening, just 3 days before opening night. The church basement has been transformed as much as budget and imagination allow, with borrowed furniture and careful lighting that creates the illusion of the Wingfield apartment suspended somewhere between memory and dream. The small audience consists of spouses and friends, technical volunteers, and a few community members who bought tickets for the benefit performance. Everything proceeds smoothly through the first act. The cast is settled into their rhythms, the technical elements are functioning properly, and the energy in the room feels focused and ready. During intermission, I allow myself to believe that we've actually created something worthwhile, that this small production might achieve the kind of theatrical magic that makes people remember why live performance matters. The second act begins with Tom's monologue about the movies, about escaping into adventure stories while his real life grows smaller and more suffocating. Julian delivers it with a restless energy that fills the small space, pacing the boundaries of our makeshift stage like a caged animal dreaming of wilderness. The audience leans forward, caught in the spell of his performance, and I feel that familiar pride that comes from watching someone you care about excel at what they love most. But it's during the final scene, when Tom returns in memory to his last conversation with Laura before leaving home forever, that something shifts. The script calls for Tom to ask his sister's forgiveness, to acknowledge the weight of abandoning someone who needed him. Julian begins the scene as we've rehearsed it, but then, In the moment when Tom is supposed to say goodbye to Laura one final time, he looks directly at me and improvises a line that stops my heart. "I should have been braver," he says, his voice carrying across the small room with perfect clarity. "I should have told you the truth before I left." The words aren't in William's script. They're not lines we've rehearsed or discussed or even hinted at during our weeks of preparation. They're Julian Blake speaking directly to Elliot Monroe across 20 years of silence, using Tom Wingfield's final moment on stage to say what he never said on graduation night when he loaded his car and drove away without looking back. Our eyes lock across the basement, and I forget that we're in the middle of a performance, forget that there are other people in the room. Forget everything except the weight of what he's just confessed in front of an audience that doesn't understand they're witnessing something real rather than theatrical. Emma, playing Laura, covers beautifully for the improvisation, responding with a line about forgiveness that brings the scene back to William's text. But the damage is done. Or maybe the healing has begun. I can't tell the difference anymore. The rest of the play passes in a blur. Julian finishes Tom's final monologue with the kind of raw honesty that makes half the audience reach for tissues, and when the lights fade and the applause begins, I realize I'm shaking. Not from nerves or adrenaline, but from the recognition that Julian has just used Tennessee Williams' words to tell me something I've been waiting 20 years to hear. The post-show reception is a haze of congratulations and small talk. Audience members approaching cast members with compliments and questions about the benefit performance this weekend. Julian accepts praise with his usual grace, but I catch him watching me over the heads of well-wishers, waiting for something. A response, maybe, or acknowledgement that what passed between us during that final scene was more than just good acting. I help clean up the space, stacking chairs and collecting props while the cast changes out of costume and makeup. By the time most people have left, I've managed to convince myself that I imagined the whole thing, that Julian's improvisation was just an artistic choice that happened to resonate with our personal history. But when I look up from folding programs, he's standing by the exit door, still in his costume shirt but with his street clothes jacket, waiting with the patience of someone who has all the time in the world. "We need to talk," I tell him, and my voice comes out shakier than I intended. He nods like he's been expecting this, like he's been prepared for this conversation since the moment he walked back into my life 6 weeks ago. "Yes," he says simply. "We do." The late April air is soft and full of promise when we step outside, carrying the scent of something blooming and the distant sound of the river that runs behind the church. Without discussing it, we begin walking in that direction, following the path we used to take after rehearsals when we were 17 and the world felt infinite and terrifying and full of possibility. The river looks smaller than I remember, but then everything from high school seems diminished when viewed from the perspective of middle age. The walking path that felt so important to our teenage selves is just a narrow strip of concrete beside water that runs shallow and unremarkable toward the Connecticut River miles downstream. But in the fading light, with Julian walking beside me in easy silence, it still feels like sacred ground. We find the bench where we used to sit and run lines, where Julian would practice monologues while I held the script and fed him cues when he forgot what came next. The wood is weathered now, carved with initials from teenagers who came after us, but it's still solid enough to hold two middle-aged men who need to have a conversation they should have had 20 years ago. "Why are you doing this?" I ask him, and I can hear the tremor in my voice, the fear and hope and anger all mixed together into something that barely qualifies as language. Julian is quiet for a long moment, looking out at the water that reflects the last light of the day like a mirror made of motion. When he speaks, his voice is gentler than I expected, full of the kind of careful honesty that comes from someone who spent years thinking about exactly what he wants to say. "Because I never stopped," he tells me. "Because I've spent 20 years trying to convince myself that leaving was the right choice, that pursuing my dreams was worth the price of losing you. Because I've had relationships with good people who deserved better than someone who was always comparing them to a memory. Because I came back here hoping to prove to myself that what we had was just teenage infatuation, and instead I discovered that some things don't diminish with time. The words hang between us like a bridge I'm afraid to cross, full of implications that could change everything or destroy what little piece I've managed to build." I want to respond, but my throat feels tight and my hands are shaking. So instead I tell him the truth I've been carrying for 2 decades. "I came to your house," I say, and the confession comes out in a rush, like water breaking through a dam. "The night before graduation. I had written you a letter, pages and pages of everything I couldn't say out loud. I stood on your front porch for 20 minutes, trying to work up the courage to knock. I could see your bedroom light on, could hear music playing. You were probably packing, getting ready to leave for New York. Julian turns to look at me, his face serious and attentive, like he's listening to testimony that might change the verdict of our entire history. But I couldn't do it, I continue. Couldn't knock on your door, couldn't hand you that letter, couldn't risk everything by telling you how I felt. So I went back to my car and sat there for another hour, just watching your house, memorizing it.